Hi, my name is Amay Kataria. I'm a new media artist. I'm currently a resident at Mana Contemporary, and I graduated from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago last year, where I studied, where I did an MFA in Art and Technology Studies. And now I'm an independent artist working and based out of Chicago, Illinois, in the United States.
Yeah, my name is Duncan and I'm going to be talking with Amay Kataria about his booth for CADAF today. We met at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, where I also studied, received dual MAs in art history and arts administration and policy. And I'm currently working as a collections researcher at the Toma Art Foundation on the digital and electronic art collection there. And so what we plan on doing is the 9 screens in the CADAF booth, sort of I would say, 3 or 4 different bodies of work that May's been developing since our last collaboration. And so we hope to take sort of shallow dive into each of these categories, discuss these, and then hopefully those discussions lead to the opportunity for questions and more in-depth discussions with the CADAF community.
So yeah, the first screen is basically based on this project called Mom, I'm Safe. This project was basically, I developed this project in April of this year when Chicago went into a lockdown, and I was having a conversation with my mom about how she's so worried about me and how they can't really see me for most of the time. And it normally is for them to chat with me, they have to call me. So I wanted to sort of reduce this friction of communication that we had, and I decided to install a webcam in my home studio where I'm sitting right now. And you can kind of see me live doing these gestures while I'm talking to Duncan here. So this basically was a project to sort of ease communication and make them see me for more like an extended period of time without the formality of actually calling me and leaving a message for me. So another feature in this was that they can actually send me messages. So you can see me interacting with the website here, and it shows some of the previous messages. So till now, there have been about 400 messages that I've collected in the database. So here, if I send a message, let's try to mine this conversation. So CADAF conversation, and today is 21st. So 06 21st 2020, and what's the time, Duncan?
3:02 p.m. in Chicago, at least.
3:02 p.m. Chicago, USA. Okay, don't lag on me so much. Okay, so I sent the message, and a receipt got printed in my studio, and maybe you saw it pop in the printer that's attached right next to my desk. And we sort of, it was a real-time sort of communication from this website to my studio. So this allowed them to sort of give me messages and send me messages, which I normally see when I wake up in the morning because I started spending a lot of my time in the studio. So this work sort of became, I would say, like the work that sort of got me through this lockdown period in Chicago, where I was completely in this social isolation mode. And still am. I mean, I don't think I have a lot of social interaction as things are still slowly opening up. But this work is sort of an ongoing project where not only my family can see it, but anybody who's outside. So I started sharing the work with my family, then a little bit of my social circle, and slowly it became public. And yeah, so this is Mom, I'm Safe .live.
Right. Well, one of the questions that I had about this project was, just who you shared the link with. I know that you shared it through some social media circles, but I wondered, who was interacting with it the most, and how often was your mom actually checking in with the website?
It's interesting. So initially, like, I started the project by sharing it only with my parents and some of my really close friends, some of my extended family who's sort of in different parts of the world. And I think that phase sort of lasted for about 3 weeks before I shared it with other people on Instagram on Mother's Day. I think that was May 10th. So yeah, 2 to 3 weeks. So I started it sometime in mid-April, and yeah, I mean, slowly, like it got a lot of messages. Some people sort of just tried it for the first time and they saw it and they said, okay, yeah, this is cool. This is great for your mother. Some people kind of send me messages for a little longer, but I think the longest that I've been receiving messages from is from my parents who are back in India. So it's like a sort of routine for them to wake up in the morning and I mean, for them it's evening and to send me a message. Sometimes I get a message in the morning. There's a decent amount of overlap that happens between their time zone and my time zone when they can actually see me in the studio or when I'm in the studio. So I think I would say like my parents have been using it the most, and I'm really happy that they are, because that's what it was made for. You know, it was made to solve a problem for them, but it sort of grew into this archive. At least from the message standpoint, it grew into like an archive to sort of look back on and reflect on these kind words, on this sort of gratitude that I've been sort of feeling for all the people who are actually sending me messages. And I mean, there are other works that I want to sort of go through, but which are sort of in response to this and is based on these receipts that I've collected, which sort of go in detail about the reflection that I have on this project.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask if you could maybe reflect on, how the sensation of receiving one of these physically printed messages, which I assume sort of comes along with, the sound, however subtle, of the receipt printer, how that sensation differs from, the feeling of receiving a text message or an email, which, we've become pretty accustomed to, especially, working remotely at this point when this is our primary means of communication.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, I've been thinking a lot about just the sort of communication style, but maybe I haven't thought enough about what the sound makes me think. I do know what it makes me think, because when I receive a message and a receipt gets printed and I'm like busy trying to do something, it suddenly sort of shakes me up, you know? That's definitely one thing. In the form of my phone, in the case of my phone, I can mute these messages, or I can sort of zone in into what I'm trying to do. But here I would have to bring down the entire system if I want to cut off these messages. But also, like, the thermal printer doesn't put out messages as often as I would be probably getting a text message, for example. So the sound is definitely interesting. I think in the beginning it was very exciting. Like when I launched the project, the sound of the receipt printing was almost evoking like a sense of excitement in me. But it sort of slowly faded down. Also, like the number of messages, of course, sort of faded down. And it only sort of filtered out to some of these messages that I receive from my parents every day. But slowly they accumulate into like this bigger thing, which I'm sort of slowly realizing when I look at my database and look at all these messages. But yeah, from the point of view of just receiving a message, I would say sometimes our parents know that I'm trying to like focus on something, so they don't message me because they think it's distracting. Because when I hear the message popping out, I would just sort of walk to the printer, like go close to it and like try and read that message, even though I can sort of read it from here a little bit. But it's been quite interesting. I think the space has become like sort of a performative space, especially in the beginning, where I felt, oh, I'm being watched. I need to be sort of take care of things. You know, I shouldn't be picking my nose in front of what if somebody's like watching me. So in the beginning, I felt almost very conscious, and I'm also the kind of person like who doesn't like actively share things on social media. It's only like I feel I'm a very reserved person. So for this, for me, this project was quite a like a flip side in what I was trying to explore. But I think what motivated me the most since the beginning was that it was trying to help somebody. It was trying to help my parents. Like now I think my parents are very much, at least from what they share with me, is they are like quite frequent, quite regulars on this channel, and they see me like quite often, and it gives them some sort of pleasure. It gives them some sort of relief, like that relief I feel gives me some sort of a pleasure. It's a very interesting, like we talk about it, and it's a very, I would say like it's a very emotional connection that I feel with it when we start chatting about it. So yeah.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting, form of communication at this point, in history, especially considering the fact that, there's in a sense no obligation to respond to these messages, when, we're so connected and have the opportunity and, in many cases, the obligation to respond at any time of day, sort of. It's interesting to implement this sort of mode of communication that where messages can be shared, but there's no, again, obligation for response beyond reception.
Totally. And
do you want to talk about the digital version of this project that you've got also, the simulator, printer simulator?
So this is totally. So this is the second screen in the CADAF booth, and oh, there you go. See, we basically mined our conversation. So it just printed that receipt because that's the last receipt that came on the printer. So I made this virtual sort of simulator. It's called the printer simulator, and here you can basically go back and see all the receipts that I received. For example, I got some of these receipts this morning from my parents. And it's basically, I was trying to create a way for people to even see what this database is sort of composed of, what kind of messages have I sort of received. I mean, most of these messages are very personal to me. Like, for example, hi, am I getting ready? It's very, very personal, like mundane, I would say, even sometimes very mundane, but some of them are really motivating. My parents would send me like some motivational messages, which has been very helpful while I've been sort of making my work or while I've been sort of going about my day-to-day things. So it's been almost some sort of like a motivator, some sort of this blessings that sort of receive from my parents every day. So I wanted to sort of create this virtual way of seeing these, so that somebody who does not have access to my own personal space where this printer is placed can actually experience it in a more simulated way on this interactive web experience. So here you can kind of go back and see all these messages. You can shuffle through them. You can print them in sequence and sort of get this experience that I might get if I'm unraveling these messages and these receipts in my own personal studio.
And that's interesting because the notion of sort of scrolling through these is very familiar, but in this project and in a project we'll discuss later on in your holography series, the idea of scrolling sort of gets made physical in a way, and I think that the printer receipt does that in a way, almost sort of making something that looks very much like a Twitter feed, these short messages, into an analog paper form. Is there something that you want to say about that sort of translation, a very sort of familiar digital sensation into the physical?
I mean, I think that, yeah, there's definitely, I think there's something to be said about that for sure, because I feel like I'm always at some sort of a quandary about where my interest sort of lies. Is it in the physical, in the tactile, or is it the digital tactility that is sort of this virtual experience? And I always like how the line sort of blurs, because I work a lot with technology. I work a lot with soft media. So I'm always thinking about, firstly, how the soft gets transformed into like the more tactile physical material and vice versa. So I think here it was pretty much the same thing. It's almost like a simulacra of what's happening here, or trying to at least achieve that kind of experience. But obviously the experience is very different. But also I feel like, for me, I don't know what's the long term, what I want to do with these receipts. But for me, it was also like a way of access, opening access to somebody who doesn't have access to something that's happening in a more tactile, in a more physical environment, to be able to sort of join or bridge this gap. You know, like it's a way to sort of see what's happening here in a more digital form. So yeah, it's like a translation that's always quite interesting, and I feel there's always so much room for like innovation and experimentation in this kind of translation.
Yeah, I think it's a it's a really fun and really interesting sort of way to move between the two, like you were saying, sort of to blur the lines between the two, and to make something that we're familiar with through the screen tactile.
Yeah, totally.
And I guess maybe when you mentioned there momentarily the idea of what might happen to these receipts long term, that might be a good opportunity to discuss Screen 3 in the CADAF booth. So this project, which you're using the title "Antidote for Social Isolation," is something that we've been discussing loosely with the terminology of books, sort of in terms of how you're containing information, physical information, but of course, a loose interpretation of that physical format.
Yeah, and I've been quite interested in that because I've been thinking like about a structure of a book versus the process that I sort of used in making the work, and how what it speaks to is sort of a culmination of that process, I feel. So when I was thinking about the process, a lot of it has been about figuring out the segments, about how this entire sort of timeline of about April, May, June, about like 2 months, just coming about 2 months, is going to be structured when I started making these bottles, or these sort of mini sub segments of the longer sort of sequence that there is. I was thinking a lot about how things are organized as chapters in the book. So I think of these little roles as segments in the bigger narrative. And that's how I sort of made them when I created like the program that I wanted to use to extract information from the database, and put together these receipts. I was thinking a lot about what would somebody see when they all sort of put it together. So also what they would see when they only have access to a specific segment. So initially, like the first iteration, I basically divided the entire timeline into a contiguous sort of collection of segments. So if you put them all together, you can find like a linear sort of continuous a narrative, continuous sort of time segment in which these messages were sent. But some of them, as I started thinking about, what it would look like in the context of an online exhibition where I'm photographing the works and showing it through the medium of a screen, I started thinking a lot about the messages that I really like. And I started creating a collection of messages and thinking about which ones do I want to show, which ones do I want to hide. But it was almost like a puzzle. Like when I made all these decisions about the messages that I like the most, the messages that I think are aesthetic, or the messages that I feel convey the sense of care and kindness that I was sort of going for by the term antidote. I feel like I started thinking about all these little bottle or these vials as portions of this antidote, as these portions that sort of come together to make this bigger thing for me. But when I was putting the bottles together, it was like a puzzle where I had to sort of figure out which is the best sort of way to photograph them and change. And it was just taking these little decisions that you can sort of go on for an infinite duration in the kind of possibilities that you have. Should the receipt bottles be open, or should the receipts be unpacked, or whatever? So those kind of decisions, which were really minuscule, but I think they made the process even more fun to sort of bring it to a photographic stage.
And while we're talking about these physical objects maybe it's an opportunity to look at the holarchy prints.
Yeah.
And do you want to, this might be asking too much, but do you want to sort of summarize the background of the project, that we're going to talk about over the next couple of screens?
Yeah, totally. I think I kind of thought about before our conversation, what is the fastest way to sort of explain the context of this work, because it borrows sort of from philosophy and a lot of literature. So I kind of want to just summarize everything by telling a short story, which is mentioned in the text from which most of the things sort of fall out. So this work is based upon the book by Arthur Kessler called Ghost in the Machine, in which he introduced a term called Holon. And Holon is basically derived from two words, two Greek words. One comes from holos, which basically means the whole, where it's used in words like holistic or holosphere. And the other word comes from on, which is used for proton and electron to describe the part. So he was trying to come up with a term that sort of combined both the concepts together in this single sort of abstract concept called a Holon. So he introduced this term Holon in the book Ghost in the Machine, and basically used the work of the Nobel Prize winner Herbert Simon to sort of break out what this concept really means. And the parable basically goes in very quickly. I want to go through that parable that Herbert Simon introduced in the book, which Arthur Kessler also mentions, is about these two Greek watchmakers. And one of the watchmakers, both are making these watches, which have about 1,000 unique parts. And one of the watchmakers prospers really well, and his business does very well. And the other watchmaker's business sort of goes down, and ends up becoming like an employee of the watchmaker who prospers. So in the parable, basically the point is that why did the other watchmaker have to sort of shut down his business, since they both had like the same number of parts? And Herbert Simon explains it by saying that the watchmaker who prospers basically divides the assembly or these 1,000 parts into these subsystems, which sort of work as these building blocks of the bigger system, whereas the watchmaker who doesn't prosper is sort of trying to organize it step by step into like from one point to the other without like a proper subsystem or these proper sort of hierarchy of stable parts. So that sort of convenes into this entire narrative about what defines the stability of a complex system. So Herbert Simon says that by having these hierarchies of subsystems, a complex system finds its stability. So this parable is used by Arthur Kessler as like a tangent to sort of explore this idea of Holon, where he says a Holon is the entity in that hierarchy of complex system which defines stability, because it has a characteristic of a whole or its own sort of self-assertive nature, where it can be sort of defined uniquely, but it also has a function of a part because it's responsible to maintain the overall stability of the system. So that this whole sort of literature about Holon and a hierarchy of Holon, which is called a holarchy, became the motivation to explore like these prints or to explore this idea through custom algorithms and generate these prints. So this series is called Holons and Holarchy, where I basically created a custom software, a custom tool that basically starts off by finding like a visual representation of what it would be like to create a system that has a point A and a point B, where things are sort of interrelated between each of the steps that it takes for point A to reach to point B. So for example, here you can see on the top, it starts off at almost like an infinite space. And it starts getting combined in like in a specific relation and goes all the way till the end to give this single entity that's made by the combination of those entities. So I kind of like to think about it as like a view from the macroscopic to the microscopic. Holon itself is is a very big sort of concept, but I kind of like to use it as an epistemic device to understand more complex systems. But here I was trying to when I was trying to read this text and understand this concept, it was more like, okay, what can I make to sort of understand or visually represent this concept? And that's what led to these kind of prints.
Yeah, and then
that was long.
I guess right, and that might be something that we folks want us to delve into more in the Q&A, just so that we can elaborate more, or we can direct people to sources or writing where we can discuss those ideas further.
Yeah.
But in terms of sort of again, translating a program, a software-based tool that you wrote to sort of translate this philosophical or literary concept into a sort of visual, I'm not going to say just sort of visual representation of the concept, but sort of a translation of that idea into a different form. Can you talk about how this differs from, say, the interactive project, or from the generative software that produced it?
When you say the interactive software, do you mean like the interactive part of this?
Right, and how how, again, scrolling, the nature of scrolling through the interactive project differs from, say, sharing a space like you were earlier today in the studio with this sort of physical print that it's hard to get a grasp of scale sometimes from images, but this is probably as tall as you and extends out onto the floor, so it shares physical space with you when you're in the gallery with it, compared to the relationship maybe you have with the interactive piece on your touch screen or on your web page.
Yeah, totally. So I think like one of the things that is worth mentioning is that one of the screens in the CADAF booth is also the interactive version of this work, which basically you can sort of run through from top to bottom or from bottom to top. And you can see this relationship that, or at least, yeah, you can kind of feel this relationship that every sort of phase in this thing has with the next phase. So for example, like these squares subdivide and start making this infinite system. So yeah, I mean, I feel like this translation for me has been quite interesting. Also, this idea of like having a virtual and a physical sort of counterpart has been quite consistent, because when I was thinking about the kind of works that I want to show in the CADAF booth, I did feel that was an important part for me to convey, because an experience that you may have when you're standing with that print in the space can be very different than what you might experience, let's say, when you're sort of scrolling down, which is just like a plethora of squares and these relationships. It's almost like can be a very mundane experience. But that, I think having these two side by side makes things very interesting for me, because then you can sort of decide, okay, what is it, which form is more appealing to you? There are some interesting questions that arise that, okay, what does it mean to sort of experience this kind of work in another form, or through like another medium, a medium that we are so used to. Here though, like, I mean, we are experiencing the print also through the medium of a screen, but it's actually experiencing that print in an interactive way like this, what is it like, what kind of questions does it raise as compared to experiencing it in the space with the print?
Right.
So having these two experiences side by side was interesting. Yeah.
Right, and yes, that notion of side by side, I'll touch off on that. Just thinking about the idea that seeing these two things side by side, you're able then to extend that relationship, which again, the idea of something that we're very comfortable with, sort of scrolling through a touchscreen feed. Once you translate that to the physical print, if you extrapolate that further, if you try and imagine the physical scale of all of the content that you consume every day, scrolling through, if you sort of extend the same logic of scale, it becomes really interesting to just think about, these Hollands here as stand-ins for data, for bits of information, and for this to be sort of, representing physically in scale, like some conceptual projects related to the internet in the past, like trying to print the entirety of Wikipedia or something, to attempt to grasp the enormity of the amount of data that we consume. I think this becomes a nice abstraction of that sort of relationship that we have with how we consume sort of passively and without thinking about these huge amounts of data.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And that kind of reminds me about some of the language that I was using when I was making the system, where I thought about all these squares that we see as units of information. Like they have certain width, they have certain color, and this unit of information got translated or combined with each other to make the next unit of information, which eventually got translated into this physical print or into this virtual experience. So yeah, I think there's a good amount to be said about that idea of how we are inundated with data and what kind of forms can it take, and what kind of forms we can realize it. And
yeah, and so you have a couple of iterations of this project, sort of different takes on physical and virtual manifestations of the Holland concept. We can look through those, and audiences can interact with those on the CADAF booth. Do you want to go on to screen 8 in the meantime and start talking about the Janus study that you've been working on with Phil Mulligan?
Yeah, so this project is basically like an extension of the Hollands and holarchy idea, because one of the things that Arthur Kessler mentioned, which became like sort of the motivation for the Janus study to begin, was that he used the Roman god Janus, who's this two-faced god, where one face is sort of facing in the past, and the other face is sort of looking in the future, as a metaphor to explain the idea of a Holland. And I felt that I connected a lot with that metaphor because, I don't know, there's something about these heads that was really appealing to me. And I felt that there was the Janus study sort of was like a way to sort of find representations of, or different representations of the god Janus in a more synthetic form, but also keeping this idea of what a Holland is, and to extrapolate on that to see what kind of possibilities are there. And I think choosing 3D was a very good decision for me, because it gave me a lot of flexibility, or it gave me and Phil, we both worked together on the project, a lot of opportunity to sort of try multiple iterations of what this thing would look like, and to decide what kind of an environment would it be in, what kind of lighting would it be in. So it was, it's my first time sort of doing a 3D project like this. So I feel like I had to sort of learn on the job when I was making this work, to sort of take these decisions, to come up with the different iterations and think what this project really means.
Right, and this is an ongoing project, right? So this is the first iteration in a collaboration that, we hopefully we'll see, future versions. And to clarify, these are stills of a video that, as we speak, is currently rendering, so that we can have a first iteration again of this collaboration to share.
So yeah, the final video is in the render process. I'm realizing that sooner we start the render, the better it is. And hopefully at CADAF, you'll see a full video of this work, and we can talk more in detail when we have the panel discussion.
Yeah, and I'm sure there are plenty of folks out there that can empathize who work in 3D in terms of render.
Yeah.
And the Sphere of Varying Gravity project on screen 9 in your CADAF booth. This was a project for a recent exhibition you were part of, right?
Yeah, so that exhibition is actually opening on 27th, which is this Saturday. And I made this work for that exhibition, and I'm sort of showing it at CADAF as well. And the premise of the exhibition was extremely fascinating to me because they chose 6 literary artists and 6 visual artists. And the curator basically shared a writing prompt that was written by the literary artists, and wanted the visual artist to sort of respond without me knowing who wrote that prompt and where it's coming from. So the writing prompt that I received from this person sometime in May became the motivation to sort of develop this work, which is called, what is it called, Duncan? Can you read that title from the thing?
Center of Varying Gravity.
Yeah, Center of Varying Gravity. Yeah, so it's a generative simulation of basically some of the reactions that I had to the write-up. And I mean, to summarize just very quickly what the write-up was, I was thinking about some of the terms that it made me evoke, or that evoked sort of some feelings in me. Some of the terms that were really critical were adaptation, unpredictability, variation, and strength, resilience. So in summary, what the writer was sort of going for, at least in my opinion, was to sort of address this unpredictability that we have become a part of in the past couple of months after COVID hit, and commenting upon like the uncertainty of the future, but trying to find some sort of a symbol which the writer saw in the fuchsia flower. Wow, it's like stuttering now with so much going on. So which the writer sort of found in the fuchsia flower as a symbol of strength and resilience.
All right, so we had a little bit of a technical issue just momentarily. Running a generative artwork at the same time that you're recording your Zoom meeting is not advisable on the same machine. We do want to just go ahead and sort of reflect back on some of the points that we covered throughout these artworks, and maybe open it up to questions from the audience, whether they're related to any of the ideas that we touched on, whether you'd like to talk further about Kessler and Hollands, or whether you want to talk about that physical virtual translation and how we relate to these different works in their various digital and physical forms. Or Amay, if there's anything that you want to say in summary also.
Yeah, thanks a lot for summarizing, Duncan. I think, yeah, thanks a lot to CADAF to give us this opportunity to present here. And yeah, I'm looking forward to your questions.